Professor Mitchell, thank you very much for being here today. I have a long list of questions. Our topic today is the problem-solving workshop. So let me start by asking you a very simple question, which is perhaps not that simple, which is how does one define this process for newcomers in terms of its uses and validity?
Okay, it's a procedure whereby you attempt to get together in a conducive environment representative voices from conflicting parties. The environment, hopefully, is informal, it's off the record, it enables people who are normally locked in a conflict or in the middle of a dilemma to step back a little bit, to be analytical and ask questions about how did they get into this particular situation, what they might do to move the relationship out of one which is completely adversarial into something which is more productive, where they can hopefully agree on not necessarily a solution, but on steps which might be taken to relieve tension, to build confidence, to search for solutions which might be mutually acceptable to them. The crucial thing is that it's informal, it's creative, it's off the record.
And who does it?
Well, these days a lot of NGOs do it. A lot of university-based researchers do it. A number of governments are trying to do it, or adaptations of the original model from, as you say, 40 years ago. Mm-hmm. It's become almost a commonplace thing that people do, and it's something which I think is often misused, but it's become almost sort of standard procedure in many parts of the world.
Mm-hmm. I'm sorry, I can't let that go. Misused in what way?
Well, the thing is that when it started, it was essentially a non-governmental process. I mean, it was done by people who were separate from the official government of their particular country. It was unofficial, it was off the record.
Done in secret.
Well, confidential, secret, if you like. It's very difficult for governments to undertake the procedure simply because they are governments. I mean, almost inevitably, governments have interests, they have reputations, they have things that they want to look out for themselves. So that if you're, the United States government, for example, which is, talks about itself as the only global superpower, there almost isn't a situation in the world that the United States doesn't have some kind of an interest in. So that in a way, it's very difficult for government, a government, particularly the United States government, but other governments, to sort of say, okay, we're neutral in this. We can't actually influence this at all. What you do is your own business. So in a way, I tend to think it's not something that governments can do very successfully.
Okay.
But they try.
Under which circumstances can problem-solving workshops be used most effectively in a complex dynamic conflict system?
That's a difficult one to answer because of the fact that the whole approach has now got out of control almost, and it's being used in all sorts of circumstances where it may or may not be appropriate. For example, our friend and colleague Ron Fisher has sort of raised the issue about, okay, not simply, what is problem solving, but can it be used at any stage of a conflict, and what are the stages of a conflict? Okay, now originally, and again I'm going back to the 1960s, originally it was used at a point where, or it was supposed to be used at a point where the two sides, if there were two, or several sides, had actually got to the point where the conflict had become overt, where perhaps violence and certainly coercion was taking place, and where there had perhaps been fighting and damage, and where the whole thing was deadlocked. You know. The idea was that that the adversaries were not talking to one another; they were talking at one another. Frequently, they were talking past one another. Therefore, it was first necessary to restore communication. And I mean, one of the things that John Burton used to talk about was that he used to talk about controlled communication. That was the first phrase that was used rather than problem solving. Okay, that you had to restore communication, but you had to make sure that it was productive communication rather than destructive. Right? So initially, the idea was you use these techniques in a post-violence deadlock situation. Okay. Now, gradually, as people started to think, hey, maybe something to be learnt by using this, they started to use them in all sorts of other situations. And so the question gradually became, when are these most effectively used? Can you use them, for example, as a conflict prevention technique? In other words, and that in the 1980s, the 1990s, conflict prevention became a buzzword. And it's quite sensible if you think about it initially, which is, okay, the way of dealing with a conflict successfully is to catch it before it actually gets to the point where people are killing each other. It's fairly unarguable. It's easier that once people have died, once people have been killed, once destruction has taken place, once you have invested time, effort, resources, and death in a situation, it becomes much, much more difficult to get out of that situation. Okay? So catch it beforehand. So can you use problem solving as a conflict prevention mechanism? Possibly. Lots of people have tried it. But what are you actually trying to prevent? Are you trying to prevent the violence in the first place? Or are you trying to prevent the violence reigniting? Are you trying to prevent reignition of a conflict? Okay. Can you use problem solving in a post-violence, post-agreement situation? Now, again, this is something which is relatively new. I mean, if we're talking about the 20th, 21st century, suddenly it's become interesting to ask the question, well, why do so many peace agreements break down? Because they do. Can problem solving help to maintain a shaky agreement in the post-agreement period? And so that's one set of questions. Okay. Now the other set of questions which gradually emerged as people started to use problem solving in the Middle East or in South Africa, or in Northern Ireland, or in Cyprus, or in the Sudan, was okay. Can we use this sort of thing in parallel with formal negotiations? In other words, is it just something that you can use when people aren't negotiating with one another or aren't even on the verge of negotiating? Is it a preparation for negotiation? Right? Or can you actually continue using it when formally and officially they're talking to one another? Now, there are some very interesting examples of people using what Ron Fisher calls para-negotiation, parallel negotiations, while formal negotiations are going on, so that it becomes a kind of a toing and froing process where the formal negotiations actually continue and then hit an obstacle, hit a roadblock. Now, is it possible then at that point to sort of take the formal conversations out of the formal setting and put them into some kind of a problem-solving arena to look at a situation in a non-official way and then come up with some ideas to put it back into the formal? I've actually was involved in the early 1990s, I think, in one of those exercises in Northern Ireland, where there were a series of negotiations going on between the between the two communities and the British government in Northern Ireland, and they hit a real snag about timing of people joining that process. And what they then came and asked us to do at the Institute was actually, can you reconvene a meeting which had taken place several months, maybe a year before, to come up with some ideas about this, non-committing ideas, but we're stuck. Try and help us think this thing through. So we actually convened a couple of meetings to say, okay, how do we get around this business that you want to include some people in this, but you want to include them at an appropriate time. Now let's think about what an appropriate time is. And so we went through a long period of arguing about this, and eventually they came up with a formula that said, all right, at a particular point in time, these set of people will come in. At another point in time, when this has happened, these people will come in. So it looks as though you can actually do what Ron Fisher calls parallel problem solving, okay?
Parallel to another negotiation process.
Parallel to a formal negotiation process which may be stalled or may be stuck. But they sort of hand you the problem and say, here, we can't sort this out, sort it out for us. So there's that issue. And then the other issue is, as people became more and more convinced that this was a useful process, an interesting procedure, the question then comes up of, okay, who do you involve in this? At what level do you operate? Now, initially, when the whole thing started in the 1960s, the answer to that was fairly straightforward. You can't involve formal political leaders. You can't involve decision makers, because then it becomes formal, and all the constraints of formal negotiation. So find somebody who is able to represent the feelings, aspirations, perceptions and misperceptions of this particular group of people, but isn't an official leader. Okay? And if they have good connections and good relations with formal decision makers, so that they can go back to the president, the prime minister, the foreign minister, and say, I've just been sitting down with these people in wherever, and we've been talking to the other side, and it looks as though there are some reasonable ideas, etc., etc. Here are some ideas. As you and Andres know, of course, F.W. Clerk's brother played a major role in that in South Africa. F.W. would sort of say something like, well, you can go and talk to the ANC if you want, but I don't want to know about that, and don't come and tell me when you've finished. And of course, Wilhelm de Klerk would go back and say, this is what happened. And F.W. would say, well, I really don't want to know about that. But of course
his brother Wimpy, the journalist, the editor of the newspaper.
Right.
So I think if I heard you correctly, what you said was it's very difficult to say when problem-solving workshops can be used most effectively, but can one define a usual set of goals, basically?
Well, that's another problem with it. You must be getting the idea that this is all terribly vague and anything goes. It depends what you're trying to do. And there are all sorts of different versions of success. Some people who run these say that the objective is long-term to change the views and perceptions and attitudes of enough people in a particular conflict so that they become at least not converted to the views of the other side, but at least converted to the view that the other side is reasonable in holding these views. In other words, it's a long-term attitude change. And that means, of course, that it is long-term, that you're trying to involve a large number of people, frequently at the grassroots, not leaders. There are others who sort of say, well, that's all very well, but it's long-term, it'll take ages. How do you convert, X million people? So you have to actually try and look at converting some key opinion leaders. There are others who sort of say, look, this has to be a top-down process. You have to get as close to the leadership as you possibly can without involving leaders. And then this will translate into actual policy changes. So depending upon who you're talking to, the answer to the question will vary. That what you're trying to do depends on who you've got there and how many of them. And the other problem is that, of course, one of the things about running a problem-solving initiative or exercise is that, you look at a lot of the books that have been written about it, and it sort of says, well, the participants are the ones who understand their conflict best of all, and they have to set the agenda for these things. They have to decide what they want to talk about. And to some extent, if you adhere to that, then what you're doing is handing over the issue of the content of the meeting and the relevance of the meeting and the success of the meeting to the participants. So that you end up with, you remember Jim Lowy at ICAR used to say, well, the great thing about whoever's running the workshop controls the process. They don't control the content. Most of the ones that I've participated in tend to be sort of elitist top-down. We're trying to affect policy. We're trying to affect it indirectly. And again, if I can give you an example, around about the same time as so at the end of the Falklands-Malvinas War, the war in the South Atlantic, as it was sometimes called in satirical magazines, it was called the War of Thatcher's Face. We actually put together some meetings in Maryland with Argentinians and Brits. I was in the interesting situation because I was a Brit, I couldn't be part of the facilitating team, so I became part of the Falklands team. And what happened was at that time, it was 2 years after the end of the South Atlantic War, both sides wanted some way of actually building confidence between the British government and the Argentine government, because the Argentinians had just suffered a major military defeat. The junta had been removed from power. They now had an elected government and wanted to repair relations with the British. The British government, on the other hand, at least some of the more sensible elements within it, realised that they couldn't keep half the British Navy circling the islands on patrol in case the wicked Argentinians tried to grab it again. They had poured enormous sums of money into the islands. I mean, they built a huge airbase so that they could airlift people down there in case the wicked Argentinians tried to seize them again. It's costing them millions. And so they wanted some kind of way of stepping back. So at least one of the things that we talked about in one of the workshops was confidence building measures. How can we actually get to a point where the British can sort of pull some of their ships back, where the Argentinians will actually get a little bit of face out of the situation, but will reassure the British that they're not going to reinvade the islands. I mean, there was no way in which they would do it, but couldn't tell that to the islanders. And so we spent an awful lot of time talking about confidence building measures, and in the end we came up with a whole list of things that could be done, which we called SUDs, simultaneous unilateral declarations, which the delegates took back to Buenos Aires and we took back to London, and which fell absolutely flat. No effect whatsoever. So was that a success? Probably not.
And let me add to that then, are there some advantages, such as you have a panel of facilitators versus perhaps a single mediator or facilitator?
Okay, let me deal with that one first. I think like a lot of things to do with problem-solving workshops, the idea of having a panel
Of
sort
facilitators.
of facilitators actually sort of came about, sort of quite by accident, and then became a sort of part of the tradition. But I think what happened was in the very early days in the 60s, the very first workshops, the idea was to have a range of expertise available to the participants who were representing the parties in conflict.
Within your facilitation team.
Yeah. And the idea was that you would need to understand a complicated process like a conflict system or the dynamics of conflict. You really needed some people who understood the psychology of being in a conflict situation. You needed some people who understood the strategies. You needed some people who understood the sort of underlying social and political structures. And so you needed to assemble a panel of people, or a panel of facilitators, as they gradually became known, that combined a multidisciplinary set of expertise. And the question was, okay, where did you draw the line? John Burton used to draw the line at you really don't need lawyers and you don't need historians. Okay? The idea was that this was not a court. This was not the application of international law or any other kind of law. So in a sense, lawyers could be counterproductive. He also, I think quite incorrectly, eventually I came to the conclusion, decided you didn't need historians. You didn't need people there who knew about this conflict, who could set you right about the details. His theory was, and I think there's a great deal of sense in it, was that the only people who know about the conflict are the people who are actually involved in it. Mm-hmm. They will tell you the history or histories. Mm-hmm. And of course what became evident as you actually sat in on these various things is that everybody had their own history. Mm-hmm. And that was important, that there was no right history. There was a history of the Turkish Cypriots had of the struggle on the island. There was a history that the Greek Cypriots had. And what was important was that they should understand that they had different histories, and this was all right.
And they're probably not going to agree on the histories.
They're certainly not going to agree on the histories, but that was a lesson they had to learn. Now, I mean, because there was this idea of you don't just have a single mediator, you have a panel of people sort of sitting there. This actually turned out to have two great advantages. One was that because there were a lot of people sitting around a table, you hadn't got this sort of structure of, us on one side, them on the other, and a mediator up there, so that you hadn't got this sort of confrontational thing. The second advantage was that the facilitators could argue among themselves, and they did. And this was all right as well, you could disagree, but then you could find out why you disagreed, so that the idea was that if the problem-solving process worked, then it began to resemble a good academic analysis, good academic discussion. Now, a lot of academic discussions are absolutely awful. They're full of ego, and they're full of bluff, and they're full of defensive positions. But a good one, where you listen and you actually listen to understand, not to refute, where you actually consider people's ideas seriously, is just the most wonderful way of actually advancing your knowledge of what the topic is. So that turned out fortuitously to be a huge advantage, to have a panel, have many facilitators. The third thing that I think was something that gradually was discovered was that having a panel of facilitators, a facilitator is somebody who makes the exchange easy, it comes from facile. Having a panel of them was much better than having a single mediator, because it took the strain and the spotlight off this single person. That if you got a good panel of facilitators together, a panel that actually was used to working together, which actually understood what was going on, then you could actually have a team, you know, and there would be a team which could actually assume various roles at different times during a week. You know, because if you've actually been in one of these things, or indeed if you've been in any kind of a meeting as a chair, you know, as the main person to run the meeting, you actually realise how exhausting it is. And it becomes even more exhausting when you've actually got a fractious group of people that you're trying to chair. Okay, and believe me, if you've ever sat down with some Israelis and Palestinians in a room, you haven't seen fractiousness until you've done that. Okay, so the actual strain of trying to keep control of that, you know, at least to prevent people shouting too loudly at one another, you know. So the great thing about having a team is that you can actually switch roles, you know. Somebody can be the person who's running the show. Somebody can be a person who is looking out for somebody, one of the participants who is not participating but who wants to participate is getting really pissed off because they're not allowed to speak. All right? Somebody can actually be, you know, this is the one that I increasingly play myself as I'm getting on in years, is the, you know, the wise old man, you know, which is a good role to play. The other one, you know, the other good one is the joker, the tension reliever. You know, somebody who can actually crack a joke and get a laugh out of it. You know, there are a whole series of different kinds of roles that you can play if you've got a group. If you've only got one person, it's very difficult to do all of these things. Right? The other thing is that one of the things, of course, that the participants try to do, the people who come from the different adversities, is that their job, as they see it, is to get you on their side. Right? You know, they don't want neutrality or anything like that. They want you on their side. And so part of the time they're playing a game with you to try to get your approval and to try to get you to become, you know, party pre to them. Mm-hmm. Well, if there's only one of you, you can't do that. But if there's a whole group of you, if there's a whole team of you around the table, one of you can become sympathetic towards one side, as long as somebody else becomes sympathetic towards the other side. Right? So that's part of the game that you can play if there's a group of you. What's important, though, is that you learn to work together, you respect one another, and you get used to sort of taking over particular roles. You know, there's a role where if the chairman, you know, the person who's running the meeting for that session gets into a problem or gets confused or whatever, then somebody has to step in and take over. Right? So there's a reserve role. You know, so a whole series of different roles in a panel. You know, that's why I think it's a much better idea than having a single mediator.
So just very briefly, but at the same time, comparing it again to mediation, international mediation processes tend to be eventually quite public, and therefore whatever statement you make or position you take, you pay some kind of political price for it. Mm. Whereas here you're doing it normally away from the public eye, and therefore you don't pay a political price for doing so, and therefore more problem solving can actually occur.
I think that's true. It's becoming increasingly difficult to do it away from the public eye, though. I mean, that's one of the things which is different now, you know, talking about the 21st century. You know, it's partly, I think it's partly the news cycle, it's partly the difficulty of actually keeping confidentiality. Mm-hmm. You know, you've got the dilemma. What happens if you're trying to hold some confidential talks, you know, a long way away from the actual seat of the conflict, and you get the agreement from the adversaries to send somebody on condition that they keep quiet about it, and then, you know, a week before you actually are going to go to the airport to meet them, you suddenly find splashed over a newspaper, you know, a story about this meeting which is likely to take place. What do you do? Maintaining confidentiality sometimes is of crucial importance because, of course, they don't want to know that they're meeting. Mm-hmm. Well, you know, there are cases where, if you think about the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, for example, you know, in the early 1990s, Israelis were breaking Israeli law by talking to people from or close to the PLO. And that makes it a bit difficult to sort of get people to agree to come. And so it's essential that if you can get them to come, nothing leaks. So, and there are other occasions where, you say to people, we will keep this completely confidential, and they say, what the hell for? We want people to know that we're meeting. Symbolically, this is important. It varies from case to case.
So returning to a question that we sort of addressed, are there a series of goals that one can clearly define? Because if there are not, and these problem-solving workshops are a series of events that stretch over years, how then does one define success?
Well, I mean, at one level, success is the fact that they do stretch over a number of years. If people find that they're worthwhile coming to and keep coming to it, that in itself is a measure of success. There are all sorts of other ways in which you can measure success. To what extent do some of these ideas get adopted by policymakers? Now, sort of monitoring that is often quite tricky, but it can be done. The whole question about is it worthwhile doing this sort of an exercise is, I think, it's another of these wretched "it depends" answers. It depends on what you're trying to do. It depends upon what the participants want you to do. It depends upon them finding some way in which it is worthwhile to carry on. And I think eventually it sort of comes to, the things come to an end when the participants find it no longer worthwhile to actually meet. And sometimes that's because no longer they're not getting anything out of it. And sometimes it's because the official process takes over from it.
Okay. So the ultimate success is not that this is a track 2 process that, if successful, gets passed on to track 1 and there is an Oslo agreement or something such?
If you're lucky, there's an Oslo agreement, but I'm not sure that was all that lucky. But yeah, I mean, I think if in fact the process gets in some way, shape or form taken up officially, or if it actually enables a track 1 process to start up, then I think that's one form of success. Yeah. I mean, other forms of success are, that somebody goes away from the actual meeting and writes an article in one of the newspapers to the effect that, there are some reasonable people on the other side and we needn't think about killing all of them.
But it's perhaps important to note that not getting to an Oslo agreement doesn't mean failure.
One always hopes to get to some kind of a formal agreement, but
because it's an incremental process.
Yeah, I mean, it's like you get sort of, well, okay, how many conflicts did you solve last week? Well,
Yeah. So now that we've been at this, so to speak, for 40 years or so.
Speak for yourself. I've been at it for 40 years.
How comfortable have governments become with, track 1 actors become with having this? Are they accepting of this process or not, on the whole? More so than they were initially?
Oh, I think so, yeah. I mean, I think the governments I know about actually, I think, regard this as, still with some suspicion, but they see that it can fit in and do things that they can't do. For example, one of the things that I learned from that very early Cyprus thing that I was involved in the 60s is that it's still extremely difficult for governments to bring themselves to negotiate with rebels. Because as soon as you start talking to them, in some sense you're admitting that they have at least some level of legitimacy in what they're trying to do, and that's what that's part of the game. You deny them the legitimacy. On the other hand, if some university naive idealists want to get together with the Basque nationalist guerrillas and talk to them in the presence of some other Basque nationalists who are not guerrillas about the possibility of a non-violent campaign to obtain Basque nationalist goals, that's a good thing. Where you don't get much of a an approval is where the government thinks that you're going to be a damn nuisance, where they think that you're interfering with what they're already doing, or what ought not to be done in the first place. Over the last year, we have been warned off a particular situation in Africa because it is felt in decision-making circles that this will simply add another complicating factor to a process which is already going on successfully. Okay, now I will quarrel with the word successfully, but at least it's going on. Okay, so legitimately, I think they could sort of say, stay out of this.
So we've just pointed to one of the important roles or things that third parties have to deal with in the problem-solving workshop, which is to get governments on board, or at least out of their way, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, if you can get sort of, if you can get the sort of reaction that you occasionally get from governments where they say, well, we don't think this will be successful, we don't think that there's much point in it, but if you want to do it, go ahead. And by the way, we'd be very interested to know what happens. Okay, well, that's a sort of sign that they want to know what happens.
Professor Mitchell, now I have to ask one or two questions that students normally fall asleep on if you ask them. They are theory related, so I trust you're going to give me a fascinating answer. It's a long question. Over the years, we started with something you referred to, which is Burton's controlled communication, a way that he early on referred to this process. We went to a number of other conceptual underpinnings: facilitated conflict resolution, problem-solving conflict resolution, problem-solving forums. It went by different names. So it also third-party consultation, something that you wrote on. So how then should we place and refer to this model within interethnic or communal conflicts? What should we call this intervention model? Dialogue facilitation, perhaps our colleague Ron Fisher at AU's word interactive conflict resolution. Having been involved in it for 40 years, how would you frame it today?
Having been involved in it for 40 odd years, frankly, this question drives me balmy. I would love to be able to say, okay, this is what it is and this is what we're going to call it. I tried to do that many years ago, and I called it collaborative analytical problem solving, or CAPS, CAPS. Nobody actually liked that at all, so it just died to death. I think the point about that was that it was nice as a description, because CAPS trips happily off the tongue. It's like grit or something like that. CAPS. It's also, I think, got a couple of things in there which are a crucial dimensions of it. Collaborative, right? It's collaborative between enemies or adversaries, which is a kind of a paradox. Analytical, because that's the sort of core of the process. It's a way of analyzing the dynamics and the structure of the conflict in which the participants are involved. And problem solving, because it points towards a future which involves recognizing the fact that we are in a problem, that it is a joint problem, that part of the problem is me as well as you, but we're going to solve it in some way, and we're looking for solutions. So if I had my druthers, I would say, let's call it collaborative analytical problem solving. But nobody agrees with me, so they go off and call it other things.
Okay. Well, bear with me for another theory question. The conflict resolution, conflict management, conflict transformation field, have your druthers, choose your term, is, if nothing else, quite interdisciplinary. So are there major social science theories that underlie problem-solving workshops? Have we indeed drawn from various academic disciplines in creating this model, broadly speaking, although you've already pointed out to us that there are variations to the theme?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the original theory that underlay it had to do with small group interaction, how groups behave, how they learn from being members of the group. And in fact, there was a lot of work in the early 70s which was derived from what's called T-group theory or training group theory. The other major source, it seems to me, was, and indeed still is, a lot of theories which have to do with the psychology of being in a conflict and how how one's attitudes, beliefs, perceptions, and aspirations get affected by being frustrated by an antagonist. And so there are a lot of really rather good theories that we've known about for a long time, which have to do with the way in which enemies and adversaries perceive each other and interact. There's a lot to do with interactive dynamics, which has to do with the way conflicts escalate and de-escalate. There is something of a myth about problem solving that it is all basically founded upon an understanding of theories about basic human needs. And I don't think that's essential to it at all. Problem solving workshops were there before theories of basic human needs. I think we've borrowed from many different disciplines. I wish, dealing with a theoretical question, I wish there was a single theory of problem solving, but I don't think there is. I think that it's a sort of combination of different theories that sort of feeds into when this thing is likely to work and when it's not. And there's some that we don't know enough about and we've not thought enough about, which has to do with where in a structure of the development of a conflict over time, where is it most effective? It's the question that you asked earlier on about at what particular stage in a conflict should this be used with the greatest success. We don't know.
So just very briefly, social psychology, what other fields were you referring to?
Anthropology, theories about ethnicity, theories about identity and political science, theories about power and influence, not sort of the crude ones that I was brought up in, for 2 horrendous years as an undergraduate. There is a great deal of, to be said for, as I say, sort of small group dynamics. Where we're not very good is where this whole thing fits into the ongoing structure of a conflict at a macro level. We need a theory of transfer and a theory of learning. But I think, in almost a sort of an inherent way, it's there because, if you look at realist theory, it's basically based on the assumption that the only way people learn is through fear and threat. Now, you don't have to have been an educational psychologist to realize that putting people in a situation where they're threatened is just about the worst position that you can put them in if you want them to learn anything. So, in a way, problem solving, I think, is actually based upon a lot of educational theory as well.
I have 5 more questions. Allow me to run them quickly and see if we can get other people in the room to also ask questions. So how is the classic problem-solving workshop model, if there is such a thing, the one perceived by John Burton and extended initially by Herb Kelman, Doob, and others, how would you say it's evolved methodologically speaking till now?
What's that bit in Don Quixote where Cervantes says something like, he mounted his hobby horse and galloped off in all directions? I think that's what's happened to problem solving. It's now used for training purposes. It's used for educational purposes. It's used for post-conflict peace building,
consultation.
It's used for conflict prevention. It's actually sort of it's been adapted and it's been used for all sorts of purposes. And
For good or bad, in your view?
I think the jury's still out on that. I think everybody does it now. And what we really need is some kind of comparative assessment about where it's worked and where it's not worked, where it's damaged and where it's helped.
Future utility for problem-solving workshops in the 21st century. Who can use them most effectively?
I'm a historian, not a soothsayer.
Okay. Is it fair to say, and this is just a question that I had because part of the problem with this model is that one is not always aware of what goes on where with this. I think a lot of people were absolutely astounded when the Oslo Agreement became public in terms of the pre-process to that, which was part of what we're talking about now. So is it fair or unfair to say that with people such as Burton, Kelman, and now your generation moving into an emeritus status at academic institutions,
Latin for getting old,
is it fair to say that, the fact that we don't hear a lot about this, that this method is sort of, in a sense, gone into the background, or is it as active as always?
My guess is that it's even more active than it was 20 years ago.
In different formats.
In different places, in different formats. And we simply don't know about it because of the fact that it's supposed to be usually confidential or below the radar or whatever it's called. Mm-hmm. But, I keep coming across examples of this, which I didn't know about. We were talking the other day, or actually I was talking with Rich Rubenstein, my colleague, about something he was writing about Northern Ireland. And he said, I was thinking about doing a piece on South Africa as well, mm-hmm. but I couldn't find anything that was going on in South Africa which sort of resembled this. And I said, well, hang on a minute, I can give you, 3 or 4 examples of things which were not necessarily using the kind of mm-hmm. classical model that you were referring to, mm-hmm. but nonetheless, were ways of actually trying to approach the whole problem about the relations in South Africa within a, very loosely a problem-solving principle, milieu, environment, or whatever it was. Mm-hmm. And I came across them a couple of years ago, So, yeah, I think there's a lot of it still going on, but we just don't know about it. And I do wish people who were doing this kind of work would at least keep a good record of it, mm-hmm. so that it would be available in 20 years' time when, the protagonists are no longer going to be harmed by it. But I do think there's a lot happening that we don't know about.
Mm-hmm. So in part, your reason for talking to us today is the fact that you have a project at ICAR, at George Mason University, in conjunction with Ron Fisher at American University, to, in a sense, reactivate, develop a new cadre of scholars and students, particularly in the social sciences. Based on what you've just said, why did you deem that necessary or important?
Well, it seems to me that a lot of what's going on is, in a way, being carried out by people of my generation. Mm-hmm. And if not my generation, then the next generation down. And what I'm worried about is that the people of your generation don't know anything about it, ought to know something about it, and ought to be able to use it. If you want to. If you think it's no good, then that's fine. But at least you ought to know something about it. You ought to know who's done it in the past, what mistakes they've made, where it has been useful and where it's, produced, some not very good results. And that there has to be a sort of continuity of tradition. The other thing is that I find that, I think about my old colleague Jim Lowy now, who used to say, you can either do this work or you can write about it, right? And he did it.
And didn't write about it.
And didn't write about it at all.
One of the things that people are very unhappy about. But,
well, I don't think he's untypical. I think a lot of people do this work, and this includes people in organisations like the UN or the AU, who do it and who use a lot of these ideas. And, they're doing it in Guinea. And then they come to the end of that particular project and bingo, partly because of the exigencies of belonging to, in this case, International Alert, they're off to the next one, right? And then, and the Guinea thing then gets left.
So we don't learn from the
So
experience.
there's no cumulative learning, and the people who are doing it aren't writing about it and aren't teaching about it. So in a sense, it seems to me important that we at least make an effort to systematize what they've found out and to pass that on. It's also, I guess, when you get to my stage of life, you want to leave some kind of a legacy behind, and basically you're trying to reproduce yourself. So basically, that's what I'm trying to do.
Okay. But in a more practical sense, how does one impart such knowledge? Specifically, if one thinks of practice skills, how do you impart that to a new generation of students and scholars?
Well, you can do two things. One is you can educate them, and the other is that you can involve them. And I mean, part of what we're trying to do down at Point of View, Ron and Susan, Alan, Nan and I, and now you, is actually give people the opportunity to sort of participate in some of these ongoing projects that's using one or other form of problem solving. And so part of the program down at Point of View is straight training, which is what we're talking about here. And part of it is involving some of the people that we've sort of trained in some of the actual real things that are going on down there.